This video is sponsored by Only Crits. This year, I've been covering the Critical Role episodes that feature Taryon Darrington, Sam Riegel's replacement character, a cocky, self-obsessed, blonde, goateed wannabe adventurer with delusions of grandeur. And he's a character who has frequently been compared to Gilderoy Lockhart, which is honestly a pretty fair comparison. But for me, he actually always reminded me of another character. Calvin Dugray, my first D&D character. Only, unlike Taryon, my character basically went on to be the Nick Fury of our campaign setting. But he filled that role in the campaigns of other players who I never even met. Today I just want to tell you about my first D&D character and the legacy he left behind on our campaign world. It's funny, my last video was kind of a campaign diary, and some people really liked that, and that was awesome. And while this isn't going to be the entire story of my first campaign as a player, a good chunk of this video is going to sound like a campaign diary before we get into the legacy part of this topic. But I'm really only going to stick to the story beats that are essential to understand where my character eventually ended up. My first D&D game was in college in September 2007. We ran that first campaign using D&D 3.5, but I never really understood that system. I basically just put the numbers where my DM told me to put them. I don't remember much about the character creation process. I do know that Calvin Dugray was a swashbuckler, which I think may have been its own class at that point. Like, I don't think it was a subclass like in 5th edition. I named him Calvin Dugray because Calvin came from Calvin and Hobbes. That was my favorite comic strip as a kid, and Calvin was a mischief maker, but he also dreamed of being an action hero, and that felt like a really good fit for my character. And Dugray came from Tristan Dugray, who was Chad Michael Murray's character in Season 1 of Gilmore Girls, because I liked that he was a sexy, svelte heartthrob. Very little of that aspect of that character really made it into Calvin, but I still loved the name. Physically, he looked almost exactly like Flynn Rider from Tangled, but that wasn't a reference. That movie was still years away. But he did look almost exactly like him, only Calvin was blonde and he had a little chin beard. Of course, the reason Calvin looked like that is because, at the time, I looked like that, except without that body type. I did exactly what so many people do with their first D&D character. I created an idealized version of myself, at least physically, because emotionally I knew he had a very clear character flaw. Now, Calvin was a swashbuckler, and so I decided that he was raised on a pirate ship, but it was specifically a ship of elves. He was the deckhand for this elven sailing ship. Probably like Treasure Island, I'm sure that was the reference. And he had set out to have his own adventures, and very specifically, he wanted to be a famous adventurer. He wanted to make his name. That's where I see the most similarities to Taryon Darrington. Well, that, and the fact that Calvin Dugray wrote about his adventures as if they were a story he expected others to read. He had a journal, which he called The Adventure Journals of Calvin Dugray, Volume 1. In fact, those were my literal notes. I had a little notebook, and I took notes in character, and I titled each adventure we went on with a cool, pulp-sounding name. And even from session 1, Calvin basically had a catchphrase. He would introduce himself by saying, "My name is Calvin Dugray. Perhaps you've heard of me," which may have been inspired by Jack Sparrow, because of course, nobody had ever heard of Calvin Dugray, unlike Jack Sparrow. Now, in that first session, we were all in a tavern. Someone came in asking for adventurers, and all of us stood up to volunteer. At the time, a couple of other players rolled their eyes. They thought that was a major cliche. I'd never played D&D before, so what I saw in that moment was people telling me that something was happening that was a cliche, but I thought it was fun. And in fact, I liked that I was getting the ultimate D&D experience, sampling the classic starting point for a campaign. I think in a lot of ways that has really shaped my approach to D&D. I really enjoy being told, this is how most campaigns begin. I'm giving you the authentic D&D experience. Now, I don't think our DM, Daniel, ever specifically said that he was trying to give us the authentic experience, trying to steer into the tropes to give us the ultimate exposure to what D&D is like, but that is how I felt in the moment. And that is absolutely the same sensibility that I bring to my own games when I run for new people. I want to give people the ultimate D&D experience, and that includes sometimes indulging in the tropes and the cliches. Now, I think at some point in the first session, we were actually told about a few different adventures we could go on. There were some goblins, there was a necromancer, and those were both to the east, and there were also some kobolds to the west. We went east so we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The goblins were ambushing travelers, so we caused as much commotion as we could to try to get ambushed, but it did not work. We found a cave with a couple of ogres inside, and we decided to go deal with them. And I was really playing Calvin as drunk. Again, probably a Jack Sparrow reference. Remember, this is 2007. The Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy had just wrapped up. There were no other films that made that franchise much, much, much worse. So I was probably inspired by Jack Sparrow. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll go out in front of the cave, I'll cause a big scene, I'll try to draw the ogres out, and then everyone else can ambush them. So I went and I shouted at the ogres, and at first they just ignored me. They didn't want anything to do with me. So I threw a rock at them, and then the ogres came out of the cave and wailed on me, and I was immediately knocked unconscious, but everyone else in the party killed the ogres. After that, I kind of dropped the whole drunken aspect of the character. It just wasn't really fun to play. I was okay with him being drunk in the first session. They had just come from a tavern. Okay, that makes sense. I just didn't want to keep playing him as drunk the whole time like Jack Sparrow. it wasn't fun to play a character who was impaired and not making good decisions. I still frequently play characters who make bad decisions, but that's just me, that's all natural, baby. Inside the Ogre Cave, we found a map that indicated that the Necromancer's Tower really wasn't that far away, so we followed the map, and we arrived at the Necromancer's Tower, we fought some undead, and we discovered that the Necromancer had not come back to life. They were, in fact, dead. But his apprentice was still alive, and she was keeping things running and surrounding the tower with zombies and skeletons because she needed protection. She was worried about the Enlightened, whatever that was. And she told us that our quest giver, Fiona, was connected to the Enlightened somehow. And around this time, we noticed an army of hobgoblins marching towards the tower. So we decided to help out the Necromancer's apprentice, Rebecca. We would kill the hobgoblins, blow up the tower, and fake her death, sneak her back into town, and allow her to get a new lease on life under a new identity. An army of goblins and hobgoblins surrounded the tower, and at one point, during this whole big fight with them, where they had to basically get through the front door to fight us, and that was the main way that we kept them controlled, or we shot down at them from the top, or fought them in the lobby. The lobby, you know what I mean. But at one point, I was in the basement with our gnome wizard who was building a bomb to take out the tower, and I was protecting our escape route, a staircase leading down and away from the tower. And I saw some hobgoblins coming up the stairs, and I asked Daniel, the DM, how is the staircase lit? By torches? And he said, yes. And I asked, is there oil on the work table where our wizard, Roth, is building the bomb? And he said, sure, yeah, there's oil. So I asked the wizard's familiar, a monkey named Nanners, to bring me the vial of oil. Then I smashed the oil onto the lead hobgoblin's head, and I ran up the wall, grabbed the torch out of the sconce, and brought the torch down on top of her head. It was awesome. Of course, the other hobgoblins immediately knocked me unconscious. This is the third session, the second time I've been unconscious, but you know what? At least I felt like I'd done something really cool. I'd effectively executed an idea that didn't have anything to do with my character sheet, which, let's be fair, is probably why I didn't do as much damage as I could have if I just swung my sword. But I was using the terrain around me to try to take somebody out of commission entirely, to remove them from the fight. That was the moment that D&D clicked for me. The moment where I realized, oh, you could try to do anything in this game. Now, after the battle, we discovered that these hobgoblins had an emblem on their armor, an eye inside a sun. And we found that the commanders had a whole lot of wealth, so clearly this army was very well financed. We also found one of the Necromancer's old books, written in a language we couldn't read, but we discovered that this is what the hobgoblins and the goblins were after. So we went back to town, we hid Rebecca, the apprentice, in town under a new identity, and then the mayor asked us to deliver a message to another town, Powder Keg. Fortunately, we learned that there was also a monastery near Powder Keg where we might be able to get the book translated. So we went off on this mission. On our way there, we found this magic plant in the forest. It started psychically communicating with some of our party members. Not important for right now, but the point is, our players had this huge debate over what to do about this psychic plant, and 2 players ate seeds from it, and as they did so, other players tried to stop them. They did not think this was a good idea. The wizard cast color spray on the other half of the party, and I'm the only one who failed my save, or whatever the mechanic was in 3.5, but I got knocked unconscious. 3 times in the first 4 sessions, I got knocked out, and I don't know if anybody else did. At this point, it was starting to get pretty old. Honestly, I probably should have switched out my dice, but I only had the one set, my first set of dice. If only there had been some other sort of resource I could have had access to, some sort of way to get other cool dice. Like some sort of vendor that I could shop at and get awesome dice. Hello there, Winnie the Pooh here to tell you all about today's sponsor, Only Crits. Only Crits is a fantastic dice company that has so many incredible sets. Now, unfortunately, we can't help get any of these dice to 19-year-old Mike, so we can roll a little bit better and not get knocked unconscious quite so often. But if we could send some dice back in time, then we would have some incredible options that would be perfect for this campaign. For example, Calvin was a sailor, so maybe Mike could roll the transparent rudder dice, which have tiny ship wheels inside, or the color splash dice to capture the roiling blues and greens of the sea, or the runic wonder dice to try to capture some of that dark magic rather than getting hit by magic every single time. Or a set of dice that looks like cheese because Calvin was just so cheesy. My name is Calvin Dugray, perhaps you've heard of me. So cheesy. You should have been rolling with these cheese dice. And honestly, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Only Crits has so many incredible dice sets, we've just begun to scratch the surface. If you want a set of dice that capture your character or your campaign, you can find them on Only Crits. And if instead you'd rather have a set of dice that just looks cool, you can obviously find those too. And if you visit onlycrits.com/SuperGeekMike and use the promo code SuperGeek at checkout, you'll be able to save 20% off of your order. This is a new deal we just made with Only Crits. It's much better than what we've been able to offer in the past, so if you've been on the fence about ordering, make sure to order today. Once again, that's onlycrits.com/SuperGeekMike and use the promo code SuperGeek for 20% off of your order. Thank you so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. Cheerio! So we made our way to Powder Keg, we dropped the note off with the mayor, we wound up dealing with an arsonist who leaves riddles, and it was my favorite session in the entire campaign. We'll talk more about that adventure some other time. However, at the end of the adventure, we learned that the arsonist was motivated by some political upheaval and an impending war. But also we discovered that his armor included the symbol of the Enlightened. They were involved in this too, somehow. Anyway, next we went to the Frozen Monastery, we fought some wild men, we found evidence that doppelgangers were replacing people around the world, and most importantly for today's purposes, we got the book translated. We learned that this organization had existed since the War of First Magic, trying to prevent future catastrophes like that from ever happening again. They had been manipulating events, possibly even creating the empire we were all living in. The necromancer we investigated in the first adventure, he had been a founding member of the Enlightened. This was his diary we were decoding, and we discovered that he had recently resigned from the Enlightened because something they had done, something they wanted to do, something he objected to. And it seems like they may have even killed him over that. And inside the diary, we found a map to their headquarters, so that was huge. We knew where we could actually try to find the Enlightened. When we got back to town, we learned that there was a war brewing. This is the same war that had motivated the arsonist. And our quest giver, Fiona, the same one who the Necromancer's Apprentice had some doubts about, well, she was trying to send us across the border to try to end the war before it started. But my character, Calvin Dugray, still wanted to go confront the Enlightened directly. So he left the group. And the reason he left the group is not entirely because he wanted to go on this adventure. Like, he would have been willing to go do that after dealing with the war, or maybe he could have convinced the rest of the players to go deal with that quest. But really, I was just tired of getting knocked unconscious all the time. I just did not feel like I had a good character. Well, I was very happy with Calvin as a character, but not in battle. Now, I don't know today how much of that was because he had a bad build, or just I was not a skilled enough player because I was so new to the game. But ultimately, I just wanted to retire Calvin and play somebody new, someone who maybe wouldn't get knocked unconscious quite so often. So Calvin left the group. I talked about that some more in this episode of Critical Role Demystified. And then in that same session, I replaced Calvin with a half-orc ranger named Radin. His name came from Joshua Radin, a musician whose work appeared all the time on Scrubs, as well as in the, at the time, recent Zach Braff film, The Last Kiss, a movie nobody but me has thought about in the past 20 years, a movie that I remember lovingly, and suspect was probably actually very terrible, but I know it had a pretty good soundtrack. Side note, I did ask my GM if he'd be willing to run some solo games where Calvin went off to investigate the Enlightened and figure out what was going on, but he said he just did not have time for that in addition to the campaign. And you know, he was a junior in college at the same time, he had just started dating the woman who now is his wife, he had other things going on. But thinking back to it, I do think it's so funny that, I guess on some level, I've always wanted to play a game where the players had a chance to break up and go off on their own adventures and come back together for an epic reunion. I've always considered it the MCU-style campaign with a balance of solo games and team games. It's something I've wanted to try for a few years now, but just never had the bandwidth to do. But I guess I never realized that this is more or less what I've wanted to try ever since my very first campaign. But of course it didn't happen for the same reason it always doesn't happen. Just a lot to ask from your GM. So now let me tell you all about Radin, the half-orc ranger. He was raised by his human father in the wilderness and... Oh, no, sorry. That's it. That's the entire character. Anyway, we went on some more missions trying to stop this war. We had an adventure in a wizard's tower in the heart of a volcano. That was fun. There may have been some other adventures as well. At this point, I wasn't taking notes in Calvin's journal, so I just wasn't taking notes at all. It was very silly. So all I remember about these next few games are these illustrations I did after every session. That's kind of all I have. But a few sessions into my time as Radin, we emerged from a dungeon and we discovered that time had moved faster in the outside world. We'd missed a few months. And then suddenly we were surrounded by soldiers all wearing the symbol of the Enlightened that had been waiting for us to emerge from this dungeon. And their leader was not in armor, he was wearing a hood, and he was telling us that he knew all about what we were trying to do. He knew that we were trying to stop a war, and he knew we were looking into the Enlightened. How did he know so much about us? Well, he pulled back his hood and he said, "My name is Calvin Dugray. Perhaps you've heard of me." It was one of the best twists I've ever seen in a D&D game. It broke our brains. We lost our shit. Nowadays, I have seen or been a part of so many D&D games with so many different twists. But man, whenever I think back to this campaign, I just remember how amazed we all were at this fantastic, dramatic moment. It really felt like we were the main characters in a movie or a TV show. I think part of the reason it felt that way is because the twist perfectly incorporated Calvin's catchphrase. It was so well set up, so well structured, perfect payoff. And I asked the GM, okay, so what is it, mind control, or is he another doppelganger? And the GM said, no, Calvin was convinced by their cause. And I remember thinking, oh, I don't know that he would be. But you know what? I wasn't playing Calvin anymore. I had handed him off to my GM. He wasn't my character anymore. He was an NPC. I don't think I even told Daniel that I didn't agree that he would be convinced. Maybe I did, I'm not sure. But still, I understood that even in my first campaign, once I'd handed off my character to the GM, they were his to control. I had a new guy to play, and now Calvin was just an NPC. I don't get consulted when the GM does anything with any of his other NPCs. At this point, Calvin Dugray is no different. However, at this point, we also basically discovered that the Enlightened were not actually evil. Or at least, they didn't have a current evil plan. They still had good intentions, they believed in their good intentions, and while that doesn't necessarily mean someone's not a villain, and I would argue that an organization manipulating society from behind the scenes is probably not a good thing, at the very least, they were not the ones actively building a doomsday weapon. Someone else was, and they were trying to summon this evil god to do something. Again, my notes got very thin around this point. But the Enlightened were trying to help us save the day. And for the final session of the campaign, our 13th session, we had to go deal with this evil cult, or whatever it was. And during the fight, we briefly saw a flicker of this evil god fighting our Paladin's god, sort of large above us. Kind of like the Moon Knight finale, only more ethereal. And as part of this mission, Calvin helped us out. After all, he was an NPC who wanted to help save the world, and he was a member of the D&D equivalent of the Illuminati. He was a pretty valuable resource to have. And here's the thing. This is the setting that my GM used whenever he ran D&D games for any of his groups. Not just the games he ran for us, but also, after that campaign was over, for other games with other groups as well. And during the summer, he would run games at a camp that he worked at, running games for kids and other camp counselors. And in some of those games, Calvin Dugray was their new quest giver. Based on the few stories Daniel told me about those campaigns, it kind of sounded like Calvin Dugray basically became the Nick Fury of that world. He would show up, give the heroes some useful information, and send them off on a new mission. And for me, the best part is that most of these other players probably had no idea that Calvin had ever been a player character. He just went on to exist as a major NPC in this setting. There's a slim but very real possibility that there are people watching this video who played D&D 15 years ago at a camp in Southern California, and right now they might be saying, wait a minute, my GM was named Daniel, and we played at camp, and we had an NPC named Calvin Dugray. I was a player in that campaign. And the funny thing is that's not even the last time that happened. In another campaign that Daniel ran for us, I played a dragonborn cleric named Miros Alos, and at the end of the campaign, he ascended and became the new dragon god, thwarting the bad guys' evil plans and saving the day. And a couple of years later, Daniel told me that some of the people in his other campaign had heard about this new god who had only ascended in the last few years or in the last decade or so, and time moves a little bit faster in the game world than it does in our world, but they'd heard how this new god had upset the balance of power, and the players thought, okay, this new god, Miros, must be evil, and so they wanted to find some way to destroy him. I really love the fact that these characters didn't just cease to exist the moment we stopped playing together. They lived on in other games in that same world. My GM and I were so clearly on the same wavelength about so many things. Not all things, but a lot of the big stuff. I mean, go figure, the guy who taught me how to play D&D tends to run D&D the way I think D&D should be run. Yeah, that makes sense. But it's really cool to know that my characters continued on in other games for other people. Because, I don't know, maybe Daniel just liked my characters a lot, or maybe it's because at the end of our campaigns, we had had such a major impact on the setting that it just naturally made sense that these characters would keep showing up in other games. But of course, Daniel would still always keep the focus on the main characters and their adventures. That was his goal. It reminds me a little bit of a shared universe, like a superhero universe, when they have to find the balance between letting your main characters stand on their own, while also not dismissing the contributions of other heroes. Like, you need to be able to explain why every Iron Man and Thor movie does not end with the heroes calling the Avengers, because otherwise, it feels like a pretty big plot hole. But you also need these characters to be able to stand on their own and solve their own problems, otherwise it's not a satisfying story. That's why I think the Nick Fury comparison is so apt. Calvin was a lot like Nick Fury because he used to have his own adventures. Fury was the leader of the Howling Commandos, Calvin was an adventurer, and now in the present day, they're both members of a shady peacekeeping organization, and they can show up as the supporting characters in somebody else's stories. And there's another thing that Calvin Dugray has in common with Nick Fury, at least in my own head. See, our group continued playing together after college. Players would come and go as they moved apart, groups would gather less frequently, but for a long time we still tried to get together fairly often. We played a lot of different game systems. And one of the last times our group all got together for a game was in 2019, and we decided to play through the Tomb of Horrors. Obviously, we knew we'd be losing a lot of characters pretty frequently, so we weren't going to bring any characters we cared about. We were going to bring a lot of characters. And a lot of the other players just wound up making random characters through D&D Beyond, or others would pre-design characters who might be good at one specific thing, but weren't, like, balanced characters with a lot of useful skills. It was just fun. We weren't taking it too seriously. So I made a few characters, and one of them was Calvin Dugray, redesigned for 5th edition as a swashbuckler rogue. And I decided that he would be the first one I would take into the dungeon. After all, if he died, well, let's be honest, when he died, he would have had a pretty good run. And besides, this game was being run by Daniel, so this new version of Calvin could just be the same guy in the same world. We started with a few magic items, and I figured he could have easily acquired those from the Enlightened. He had access, certainly. Now, Daniel told me that it had actually been a couple of decades in the world of the game since the events of our original campaign, but I was already thinking of Calvin like this world's version of Nick Fury, so as far as I was concerned, that wasn't an issue. He could still seem pretty young. For those who don't know, originally Nick Fury was a World War II comics character. Well, I mean, he was published during the 60s. He was not contemporary to World War II, but his comics took place in the 40s. Then when he showed up as an Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., he was a World War II veteran who was just starting to go gray. After all, it had only been about 20 years since World War II, so he could easily be both a World War II veteran and a modern character. But thanks to the sliding timeline of Marvel Comics, modern stories were taking place further and further away from World War II. But you couldn't just remove that part of his backstory. Eventually, someone decided that he had kept some sort of serum that made him stay relatively young. Not a 20-year-old necessarily, but young enough that he could still be in action and have just a little bit of gray hair. That was his iconic look, after all. So he had this World War II backstory, but he could still show up in modern comics that took place in, like, the 2000s, because he had this serum that kept him young. Ultimate Nick Fury was introduced as a contemporary character, but we did eventually find out the same thing about him, that he had a similar origin. He had fought in World War II, and was also supernaturally made young with the powers of science. So I figured maybe something similar happened with Calvin. After all, this is the world of D&D, it's not crazy to assume he just takes some sort of youth serum. So we explore the tomb, and Calvin was one of the first to trigger a trap. He got teleported to some other corner of the dungeon. But thankfully he was not killed. He still had his equipment, so he just kept navigating the dungeon, essentially crawling through the air ducts, coming across a puzzle or two, and getting very, very lucky. And eventually he found his way back to the group. Trust me when I tell you, it could have been so much worse. And other characters were dropping like flies. Players were cycling through a ton of pre-gens. Calvin was just getting lucky. There was one point where I literally had a choice between two paths, and Daniel told us after the fact that one of those would have led to certain death, but the other led back to the main body of the dungeon, and Calvin survived and reunited with the group. Although, in fairness, the dungeon itself is kind of certain death, so, like, getting back to the main group does not mean that you're safe. Speaking of which, towards the end of the dungeon, Calvin Dugray did fall victim to a trap. A steamroller came out of the door and crushed him to death. But one of the other players realized they had a power, a reaction that could have been used in that moment. He hadn't used it in that split second because, well, first of all, the traps in Tomb of Horrors aren't really designed in phases. They're not really a ton of warning about what's going to happen, because when Tomb of Horrors was first published, you didn't have the reaction mechanic like we do today. But also, half the players were playing brand new characters every 90 minutes. They didn't always know all of their powers that well. So we asked the GM, we said, it's your call, but could this character have used this power in that moment as a reaction to save Calvin? And Daniel said, yes, okay, it looks like your character is close enough. You would have had a reaction. We can wind it back and let you save him. So Calvin survived that trap that did not kill him. And then in the final fight of Tomb of Horrors, one of the most lethal adventures of all time, Calvin did not die. I don't think the final fight is supposed to be the most lethal part of the adventure, but you know as well as I do, Calvin did not have the best track record when it came to staying conscious during battles. So that was a huge win for me. And once the final fight was done, Calvin just started loading his bags with treasure, and he went home. So Calvin is like one of the most legendary characters I've ever played. There are tons of other characters that I played for a lot longer. Like Sweeney, aka the Judge, was someone I played for 2 or 3 years. I took him all the way up from low levels to level 20 and beyond. Sweeney's probably my favorite character I've ever played. I just can't stay away from him. I love that character. But I'd kind of forgotten what an epic run Calvin had. From a personal perspective, running up that wall and smashing the oil on the hobgoblin and lighting her on fire is always the moment I go back to when I think about how cool D&D can feel when you're able to decide how to tackle certain problems. It was the moment that I felt rewarded by D&D in a way that I didn't really feel from other media. It was really cool. From a story perspective, my former character coming back as a member of the Shadow 8 organization we've been learning about all campaign and revealing himself to us was so incredible. It is still one of my favorite twists I've ever experienced, either playing in, running, or watching a D&D game. And from a larger cultural perspective, in the D&D community overall, when we're talking about bragging rights, Calvin survived the Tomb of Horrors. That's like the ultimate measure of success in our hobby. He went through the whole Tomb of Horrors from beginning to end. That's pretty awesome. For a huge section of it, he was going through solo with no one around, crawling through the air ducts, basically. Calvin left our first campaign during session 8, and 13 years later, we did 2 sessions to get through the Tomb of Horrors, so I've only played him for 10 games overall. I played plenty of characters for longer than that, especially with our old rhythm in college where we consistently ran games for about 13 sessions. But even though I played him for such a short run, his legacy has endured in a way that's kind of only possible when you play in a campaign setting that you know will carry on beyond the end of the campaign itself. And that's it. That's basically all I wanted to talk about today. I've had so many elaborate videos lately, I needed a quick, easy video. Since April is the anniversary of my channel and my birthday is in April, this always winds up being the time of year where I look back at everything I've accomplished so far and I start to reminisce. But I've got some other things I need to get done today. My wife is out of town on a work trip, and I promised her I'd at least get a little bit of housework done while she's gone. And our backyard has this hill that is just covered in hideous weeds, so I'm gonna go do some yard work. I'll see you later. Okay, here's the thing. I've been talking about my first D&D campaign, and I've been showing you images on screen from that campaign. This was basically fan art I made of our game, because I believe it or not, I thought playing D&D was too nerdy, and I thought it would offset the nerdiness for me to do something cooler, like drawing our characters, which is a hilarious sentiment for so many reasons, that I somehow thought doing these drawings was less nerdy than just playing D&D. But each of these images is directly inspired by a comic book cover, usually one that was coming out around the same time I got into D&D. But you know what? I think it would be fun to go through all these images and share which comic book covers I was ripping off when I drew them. These were all freehand drawings I wasn't tracing, but I sure was referencing other art. So I'm just going to make a video where I do exactly that. I'm going to put it on the Patreon for anybody at the See Invisibility tier. And in that video, I'll also tell you a little bit more about the campaign, about the things I skipped over. I'll tell you all about the psychic plants. So if you want to watch that video, go check out the Patreon or become a YouTube member at $5 a month or more. Okay, for real now, that's it for today. But I'll see you later this week for another episode of Critical Role Demystified. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. My first game master, Daniel, went on to work with me on another actual play show called Wrath and Story. I was the editor, and he was the game master for a Warhammer 40k RPG that was a lot of fun. Those episodes are all on YouTube, and I think they're on an actual feed as well. I'll put the links below, but he has his own show now, his own actual play show that I'm not involved in, I'm just a fan of, called Daniel's Dread Tales. It's a horror campaign. I was in an episode where we played kaiju who were fighting each other, and he was running that game. That was a lot of fun. But he just does a bunch of different horror games. Sometimes he does one-shots, sometimes he does longer campaigns. It's a lot of fun. Go check it out. The link for that is also in the description. It's on YouTube, but it's also on all of your various podcast apps, so go check that out. I did a live stream this week. If you missed it, it is saved on my Patreon. It's for anyone at the $3 a month tier or higher, so go check that out. That was a lot of fun. And other than that, watch my Fey Week video. It was about how to play a changeling from like English and Irish and Scottish mythology in a D&D game. So watch that video right here. It was a lot of fun. I think you'd like it. Until next time, play fair and have fun.